very much for having me. For a brief moment, I thought it's going to be much more difficult to speak, not to be early in the day with sort of similar ideas, similar challenges. But then I thought completely otherwise, that we are all looking at the same problems from a slightly different perspective. And what I would like to bring it to you today is a very financier perspective out of this, right? So I'm a former venture capitalist for 10 years. I'm one of the evil guys who invested from the US into Europe, right? So exploiting the European engineers by profiting US capital market, which is sort of symptomatic. And I've been looking at the tech scene for a long time, relatively long time for recent developments. And I thought I'm so observing the race. I thought I'm observing the robotics race. We had an early days of robotics. We had an early days of drones. And then I visited Shenzhen, I think it was 2 years ago. And I've realized that I have to make a confession. And the confession is I've been watching the wrong race. And there are very, very, very important notions coming out of this, very systemic ones. And I'm not entirely sure if we all looking at this from different angles, we see the gravity of the situation and the whole scope of the challenges that are ahead of us. So in order to properly take a look at this, let's first take a look at those three ecosystems that are important players in the global scale of robotics and autonomous applications. And the first one that impressed me the most is China. And we tend to use China as an idea of a hardware provider, as a distribution partner, but the reality is that it's much, much, much deeper. When we put the numbers into work, we see that the scale is absolutely tremendous. So last year, the only ecosystem on Earth that has actually increased the amount of robots installed at the industrial plants was China. It was uptake by 5%. The scale is over 300,045 units per year, so over 300K, right? This is the important number to remember. And if you would take a look at this purely financially, China is deploying. It's very difficult to get the right assessment if we're going to net out the government support, but we can safely assume it's between 10 and 15 billion US dollars to robotics, right? So this is the landscape. But I think the most important part isn't how large is the money flowing through the ecosystem, is the way that they're flowing, because they look at this at the very different angle that we do here in Europe and we do in US, because they are not deploying this money independently to the companies, but they're actually trying to build out this in a very close cooperation between a factory and a research lab. And the turnover cycles are much quicker. So what I've seen last year is that when we ordered first, as a company building a general models, when we first ordered Chinese hardware from Galaxia, guys sent us a robot and we thought, okay, this is not the robot that we've ordered, right? The specs are off, the manual is not working, something is off. We thought, okay, it's our fault, we've mixed up the order. And so we called the guy, and the guy told us, no, like we've made 2 other iterations during the time that you were actually processing your order. So that's the version 3.0, we're going to send you the manual, right? That's the velocity. And the velocity comes from this very simple notion that they are doing this purely deployment first. So they are deploying the outcome of a lab work, of testing to the industrial facility. And they are very quickly redoing what they have learned during deployment back at the lab to improve the hardware and the software for this to be actually of utmost usefulness. So we have China. We have US. The US is a slightly different animal. Again, to get the sense of a scale, US has implemented 30,000 robots last year, which is less than 10% what China has implemented. So the implementation gap is absolutely tremendous and a horrifying one looking from a Western Hemisphere perspective. Where US defends itself is obviously the software. To get the scale of the software software support that they are getting, generally US as a capital market is deploying around $10 billion into robotics scene. So slightly smaller than China, probably. If we're going to count in the US government indirect support, that would be a similar outcome. But what is most important is that they have a very different growth path. So US companies, US startups doesn't focus on actually deploying, they're focused on, they accept the very lengthy sales cycle, but they have enough capital to burn through the deployment cycle, not very effectively, but they are trying to do this. And they hope that finally they will find their way through the customers' pain points to actually make a deployment and to build a healthy business model. And we have a third ecosystem here in Europe, and we are sort of in between. If we take a look at the actual installations, it's not that bad. It's over 80,000, so much better than US, much worse than China, somewhere in between. But when you look at the scale of financing, it's a little disturbing, because we tend to spend less than 1 billion annual in robotics. This year is going to probably be the best in the history with 1.5. Still, fraction of what those two other large ecosystems are spending. So we need to take an action, and we need to decide what growth path we'd like to follow. And it's a very coordinated action. And I don't necessarily agree with some of the comments that my predecessors have mentioned, that it's a cultural problem or it's a technical problem. Obviously, robotics is a full stack problem, right? It's a problem of hardware, it's a problem of software, it's a problem of implementation, but it's predominantly a problem of time versus money. From where do we see it? Because we should either focus on having enough money in the bank to live through the cycle the way that the Americans are trying to do, hopefully to get there, or we can play the different game, which would be the game the Chinese are playing, so a game of much quicker development. So not being too pessimistic, there are good points. And I think that there's one thing we heavily, as a Europe, I think we are feeling this thing being literally over here, and it's a great place from this perspective as well, that we're sitting on the southern end of a blue banana, right, corridor that stems from Liverpool to Milan, the industrial and urbanized corridor. And if you think about this from a VC perspective, it's sort of a unique place, because in a proximity of Como, probably within a 100-kilometer radius, you would have 2,000 companies that are easily deployable places for robotics to work with. Comparing to Silicon Valley, when you have really to work your way through whatever the industrial plants are in Montana, Kentucky, part of Texas, part of Boston, North Carolina, it's much more difficult task, right? We have a cluster, and we don't use full advantage of that cluster, and this is something that we need to fully understand and fully take into action. So, what would be the choices that we are facing? We could be a place which is a customer, so we can basically import hardware stuff from China, hardware software stuff from US, and just be a customer, but then we won't have a margin, and we all here, being a part of the robotics ecosystem, will slowly die out. So we need to cross out that action. We have second route. The second route would be to be an integrator, and it sounds much better, but I think it's a very short game. We can try to play with the software created in the with money from Silicon Valley, and we try to play with the hardware that we don't manufacture over here, and try to be the implementation masters in companies, but it's going to soon end up with verticalization of those companies and the integrators being cut out of the equation. And there is a third possibility, that we actually try to defend the ecosystems, and we'll try to use the deployment game that that lies in front of us, the possibility that we have, and try to be much more aggressive on the deployment side. So the question is very simple, how to do that, right? And I think there are 4 super important actions that we need to take upon. The first one being change the way that we finance robotics. We don't need any more research and development grants. I'm really sorry to say that. On a massive scale, I think that the venture capital market in Europe can really support that part of growth path. The problem starts with the question, who will actually pay for deployment pain points, deployment failures, deployment delays. How to make sure that the companies will not be unnecessarily burdened with the cost of R&D that is happening, and on the other side, that the startups will have enough comfort and enough support to get to that most important part, right? So switching financing from grants to deployment and make it much more market market-forwarded and market-oriented is something that I personally consider of utmost importance. And this is also the feedback I got from the companies. I was absolutely horrified a couple of weeks ago. I spoke to the 5 large industrialists from Europe, and we've all agreed on diagnosis. We've all agreed that it's needed, that it's imminent, that it's going to happen sooner or later. We've all agreed on that part. The problem was, okay, what is going to happen if the deployment is going to take too much of our time and attention? And this is the part we couldn't find a common language, right? So there are basically, for me as an entrepreneur, 2 options. I could say, I'm going to pay for this, so I'm going to play for a year with your factory, and I'm going to cover whatever problems going to appear, whatever resources you will burn through because of my not 100% readiness to actually deploy, or there is a mechanism that would support that. So this is something that on the crossroads of entrepreneurship, finance, and the public sector, we should think about very deeply. Second part is hardware, and I heard several times that hardware is ready, that hardware is advanced. Yes and no. For sure, the advancement is tremendous, and the hardware is deployment ready. But if we're going to go really into the details, we're going to soon realize that there are use cases which have tremendous ROI that could be easily deployable, but the crossroad of software and hardware doesn't necessarily work. And there is a wisdom into what Chinese are doing, because by bringing those ecosystem much closer to deployment and the research much closer, both hardware and software, to the factory, we learned that the hardware also had to be industry specific or use case specific, because sometimes you're going to go to a -20 freezing place at the FMCG and you realize that your robot is not working that well, right? And this is something which could probably be fixed within a matter of weeks when you actually have the knowledge and you have a very quick connection line to the hardware manufacturer. So the hardware is a problem, and what happened to European hardware scene should also cooled us a little bit, because from the last, if we're looking back in the decade, KUKA was sold to China, and ABB Robotics was sold to SoftBank. So we've lost 2 largest hardware partners that are not anymore decision-based or ecosystem-oriented for Europe. They're actually present there, but we are much closer to being an integrator than being a partner for them. And the third part is infrastructure. And again, we were talking about data sovereignty, we were talking about computing power. But the problems that we sometimes, as a software companies working in robotics space, we are facing, it's not the existence of computing power, it's the price. European providers are on average 20% more expensive than US GPU providers, right? So we as a software entrepreneurs, we are all voting with our wallets, because I cannot select European provider who's 20% more expensive, because I couldn't afford that, right? So it's not only a question of availability, it's not only a question of scale, but it's also a question of the cost. And it goes both for deployment infrastructure, and it goes both for computing infrastructure. So those are the 3 action points, which sound a little complex, but I think they are doable in the next decade. But I think we should reframe a little bit the way we are thinking and feel the scale of the challenge that is ahead of us. Thank you very much.